Well, tēnā koutou katoa. I think we should probably make a start. Some people may still turn up, but we should probably honour the time that we advertised and get underway. My name, I think probably most of you have met me. If you haven't, my name is Chris Marshall. I'm the Professor of Restorative Justice here at Victoria University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture. The title of tonight's lecture is on the screen: Restorative Justice, Campus Assault and the Me Too Movement. And there couldn't be a more timely moment to consider such a topic. As we all know, the Me Too movement has triggered something of a global reckoning about the prevalence of sexual harassment and assault across workplaces of every kind. It has opened the floodgates of women in particular telling their stories of abuse in a huge diversity of settings, though with remarkably similar themes to emerge. Here in New Zealand, public attention has been focused most recently on a culture of abuse, or perhaps a culture that permitted abuse, in New Zealand's largest law firm, Russell McVeigh, following claims that 5 summer law clerks from this university, in fact, were sexually harassed by a former partner and solicitor over a 3-week period some 2 years ago. Public disclosure of these claims led the firm to commission an independent review of its systems and policies by Dame Margaret Blazey, which was published just last week, and maybe some of you have seen. It's certainly been a lot of media attention to it. And this episode has prompted serious soul-searching on the part of the wider legal profession in this country, which can only be a good thing. But the problem, of course, is not confined just to corporate law firms. If there's anything that the Me Too movement has demonstrated, it is that a significant percentage of women encounter harassment, gender discrimination, unwanted sexual advances, and outright sexual assault on a regular basis in employment settings right across society. The same is true of educational settings. In fact, the incidence of harmful sexual behaviour is a disturbingly common phenomenon on university campuses, as those who provide pastoral care to students can attest. Although it's yet to attract the same level of media attention in New Zealand that it has attracted in the US and elsewhere. Research on gender harassment in New Zealand tertiary institutions is also still quite limited, although what has been done here confirms international findings that show that universities are significant sites for sexual assault and gender-based harassment and discrimination. Very unsafe places for women in particular to be. And that's the subject of tonight's lecture, along with the role that restorative justice can play and might play in addressing this problem. Our speaker is well equipped to speak on the subject. David Karp is a professor of sociology at Skidmore College in New York. He's an accomplished academic with over 100 scholarly articles and 7 books to his name, which is all very impressive. And he is, I think, many of us would believe, one of the important voices in the restorative justice field at this time. He has made a particular contribution to promoting and evaluating the use of restorative justice processes for dealing with student misconduct on tertiary campuses, which is why we invited him to come to New Zealand to serve as an expert commentator for a round table which we held yesterday here at Victoria on advancing our vision for Victoria University becoming a more restorative or values-based institution. Most recently, David helped to found a program called PRISM, which always sounds to me like a sort of spy network, PRISM, but it's an acronym for Promoting Restorative Initiatives for Sexual Misconduct on College Campuses. And it's his work in this area in particular that has made him a sought-after commentator in the US at this time on how restorative justice can help address the harms caused by sexual misconduct, not only on university campuses but in workplaces as well. and harms that are sometimes, perhaps often, compounded by the adversarial mechanisms that we often use to deal with it. So please welcome David to the podium to give his lecture. Thank you.
Kia ora, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Chris, for the generous introduction, and overall an incredibly welcoming reception to your incredibly beautiful country that we're really enjoying. Before I get started, I just wanted to share a little bit about where I'm from. I come from New York State, and this is where I live is roughly that dotted line between what was traditionally Mohawk land and Mohican land. And the town that we live in is Saratoga on this old map way on the right. You can see it's along the Hudson River with a couple of old Revolutionary War forts just north, 20 minutes or so from us, made famous by the 1992 Daniel Day-Lewis movie, Last of the Mohicans, in the 1820-something novel by James Fenimore Cooper. That's a territory where we come from. There's some translations of the places where we come from. And in a more contemporary way, just to show you where we live, the top left is the Hudson River Valley, near where we live. The top right is my college campus in winter, which is a lot of the year. Our house is in fall with our Japanese maples in full red. And that's my family. One of those people looks a lot like the person right there, my wife Gina, and our two daughters, Julie and Abby. So that's the little bit of the background before I get to this much more troubling topic. I guess I have two screens here, so if you're uncertain about what's on this screen here, it's translated right there for you to read. So the Me Too movement is in full swing now, and there's a lot of writing, a lot of reflection about people's bad experiences in current moments, as Chris was just mentioning last week, referring to incidents here, to incidents that have happened over the course of people's lives, primarily women's lives. In one article in a popular magazine, an author, Deborah Kogan, was writing about an experience that she had being sexually assaulted the night before she graduated from university. And this is the picture of her on that graduation day, immediately afterwards. And so what she wrote, I'll read it. It's hard not to wonder now from my perch of more than a quarter century later, staring at that pinched look on my face in the photo from that rainy graduation morning, why there hadn't been a third option besides either pressing charges or doing nothing, neither of which felt like an appropriate reaction to what had happened to me in that bed. And that is the predicament that victims of sexual assault are confronted with everywhere, about a dilemma about what to do in the aftermath. And the choices available to them are often limited to something more than they want to do, involving themselves in systems that seem out of their control, to doing nothing, which is actually what most people choose, and in fact what she chose. More recently, as part of the ongoing exposés of campus sexual assault, a book was published 2 years ago by John Krakauer's. Many of you will have read his book, Into Thin Air, about Everest. He's a popular author, a good writer. He wrote a book about the University of Montana and the experience of students there. And featured in this book are these two students. So what is often a very confidential process, in this case, was quite public. So these are not my pictures, they're from the news. What I know about the case comes from the book and websites. But it was essentially featured in terms of the experience of these students, both as they interacted with the campus disciplinary system and the criminal justice system. So Allison Huguette and Bo Donaldson were childhood friends. They grew up in the same town of Missoula, where he went to college. She went to a different university out of state. She came home for Thanksgiving and regrouped with a group of with their friends, including Bo. Ended up drinking late into the night. She fell asleep on a couch, woke up to Bo sexually assaulting her. She ran out of the house, called her mom, who picked her up, and then, most unusually, the next morning, she and her mom called Bo over to the house, who was so well known to them, and confronted him over what had just occurred. It turns out Bo told them that he himself was so distraught over what had just occurred that he sat in his truck the rest of the night with his gun, thinking about committing suicide. And they had what I would think is a kind of restorative conversation, confrontation leading to a plan, and a very direct confrontation over the harm that had just occurred. And so what she said is captured here, that he promised me that he would get treatment for his drug, alcohol, and sexual issues, and I made it clear that this promise was the only reason I wasn't going to the police. So they did it, in a way, a restorative encounter by themselves. And it's not the takeaway that John Krakauer has from this story. It's the takeaway that I had from learning about it. But also troubling was what happened next, which is that he made promises. She went back to school out of state, and then he didn't follow through. And then a year later, when they saw each other again, he was with his group of friends, he was on the football team, and his attitude had shifted. His mindset had reverted back to the team mentality, and he was hostile, defensive towards her, instead of supportive. And at that point, in fact, she did go to the police. And then there was a police investigation. And then also what was unusual about this case is that there was serious consideration by the courts. Bo Donaldson was convicted of rape, and he went to prison. During that tumultuous criminal justice process, Allison was confronted with incredible community rejection. She became an outcast from the community by being a sexual assault survivor because she was challenging a member of the hallowed football team and threatening the success of that team. And so the alliances were with the team and not with her. And so she suffered even further as a result of her bringing this to the attention of the police. So it's a tragic story all around. There were nothing but losers in a process that was designed for justice. And even in this case where there was technically justice, that is, she won the case, he went to prison, she felt still as if she had lost. From an empirical perspective, the data are very troubling. Here are the results of a survey of female students at a Midwestern university. I believe it was the University of Michigan, so a very large university, 50,000 students. They surveyed 834 female students, asking them about their experiences of victimization, and 284 of them said that they had been sexually assaulted during their time at the university. An astonishingly large number. But equally astonishing is the number of students that actually chose to say something to anyone on that campus. And that refers to reporting to health services, the counseling center, or the campus police. So basically, students experience victimization but tell no one about it. Or if they tell anyone, it's a friend or a family member, but it's not the campus or the police. And as you can see, way at the bottom here, even from those 16 that did go forward with reporting, only 5 of them chose to file a formal complaint and pursue the disciplinary process available to them. So what that says to me is that there is a huge gap between the experience of victimization and the kinds of services that we provide that are compelling enough for students to come forward and get support in response to. These individual incidents are embedded within a larger cultural system, often called rape culture. And so some of the characteristics of this are this idea or a set of attitudes that support men to sexually take what they want, when they want it, regardless of consent. And it's well known that it's pronounced in all male institutions like fraternities and athletic teams like football teams. It's reinforced by the pervasive pornography that students are exposed to, and further fueled by the binge drinking culture that's characteristic of student culture. And then further, there's been some good books written about what is called hookup culture that is characteristic of dating relationships or sexual relationships, not even dating relationships, where students are having sex first and then deciding to date later or get involved in relationships later. So a lot is happening in those first encounters that is complicated in terms of their communication and their experience. This is an image from a fraternity a couple of years ago on a campus during orientation. So when students, freshmen, first arrived on campus, they drive down Fraternity Row and are exposed to banners like this that says something about what the intentions of the community are, or the norms of at least the fraternity culture. So there's a problem, it's widespread, and then there's been a response to that problem. And in the United States, the regulatory scheme for response has been organized around federal legislation known as Title IX. And that's important to understand if we were to understand the grassroots student movement in response to this and what's happened on campuses. There's a separation, first of all, between what is done by the police and what is done by campuses. And so crimes are addressed by police. People can report crimes and go to police and have them adjudicated in the criminal justice system, but at the same time, they can also report to campuses that policies have been violated, and campuses can undertake their own disciplinary actions. Title IX is the regulatory model. The wording of the legislation is here from 1972. It was originally designed to address sexual harassment and gender discrimination, and oddly, sexual assault falls under the broader category of harassment. And even more oddly in the legal framing, the problem of sexual assault is not the crime per se, but that it creates educational inequality. In other words, if female students are being sexually assaulted, that creates an inequitable educational opportunity for them. So they can't enjoy the privileges of education if they're being sexually assaulted. So the goal is to guarantee access to education. That's actually how the law is framed. And the school is responsible for creating a conducive climate for learning. And so the expectations are captured at the bottom, that the school is responsible for taking effective corrective actions to stop the harassment, prevent its reoccurrence, and remedy the effects on the victim. So the student movement is organized in response to the federal legislation. One of the most well-known student groups to emerge in the last several years is a group called Know Your Nine, meaning know this legislation and use it to advocate for your rights. And so as part of the promotional campaign, you see flyers, posters, social media that look like these kinds of things. So I started a magazine about sexual violence at my school because survivors need a space to make our community near us. I said that wrong, but you can read it. I started a survivor support group because in order to create change on campus, we have to take care of each other. I filed a Title IX complaint because my school didn't provide the academic accommodations I needed after my abuse. So that's some of the messaging out there and the student effort to raise awareness around Title IX and enforcement. And then there's student movement that's much more activist in terms of protest, demonstration, and really a strong adversarial relationship between students and campus administrations. And that's captured more by the kind of the flavor of these photos. And you can see the representation of Title IX in the background on that doorway. One of the other important student activist groups in the U.S. is EROC, or End Rape on Campus, that was organized by a group of students who were helping students file formal Title IX complaints so that they could get the universities to take their complaints or reports seriously. And then I think really because of the student movement and the activism that they had and the attention that was brought, we've seen the emergence of the Me Too movement. It's not the only social force involved. Of course, we had an election in the United States, and sexual assault by our current president was featured centrally in the campaign and raised attention to workplace harassment, sexual assault, and the experiences primarily of women historically. And so you see protest marches and a significant amount of calling out of celebrities, of prominent law firms, almost on a daily basis. And then you see response, some of it rather pitiful, as there is this newfound exploration of accountability. What does it mean to call someone out for their misbehavior and then have them respond and take responsibility? So I had never heard of this guy. I don't know if you have, but he's a celebrity chef. He owns many restaurants. He's a wealthy guy and writes cookbooks and is very popular, and was accused of sexual misconduct. And his response, which got a lot of negative reaction, it's very hard to read this, even for me here. So I'm going to read it to you. So he tweeted this out. As many of you know, this week there has been some news coverage about some of my past behavior. I have made many mistakes, and I am so very sorry that I have disappointed my friends, my family, my fans, and my team. My behavior was wrong, and there are no excuses. I take full responsibility. Sharing the joys of Italian food, tradition, and hospitality with all of you each week is an honor and a privilege. Without the support of all of you, my fans, I would never have a forum in which to expound on this. I will work every day to regain your respect and trust. MB. P.S. In case you're searching for a holiday-inspired breakfast, these pizza dough cinnamon rolls are a fan favorite, and then you can click below to get the recipe. So this is someone who does not have a very good publicist because it's such an epic fail in terms of communicating what needs to be communicated in response to serious allegations of misconduct. And ironically, I think this is an important reflection of the state of affairs in terms of our ability to take responsibility. I mean, culturally, We don't know what to do in response. We don't know what it means when someone does take responsibility. We don't know what it means to take responsibility in a meaningful way, and that creates the space for restorative justice because culturally we're lagging behind. Chris mentioned our project Campus Prism, which is a network of academics and campus administrators and restorative justice practitioners and students who are exploring this question: how do we create the conditions in which it is possible for someone who has caused sexual harm to acknowledge and take responsibility for that harm? It's almost in full opposition to the conditions that exist now, which really promote denial and minimization of responsibility rather than taking responsibility. So that's the challenge and the framework in which we're exploring this work on campuses is captured in this pyramid. And so it's not so much, it's not so limited to responding to individual incidents and accusations, but also about building a culture of communication in which students and faculty and staff learn how to communicate in ways in which they fully understand what it means to engage in healthy sexual relationships and romantic relationships, and don't get themselves into the hot water that has been created by all of these tragic circumstances. So much of the work is educational and prevention oriented. That's at the base. And then there are responding to incidents when they occur. And then finally, it's less, I've learned, common here to suspend students, but it's very common in the US. And when you suspend a student for a period of time, they come back. And when they come back, the campus is anxious about their return. And so managing that process successfully is important as well. So just to mention first about that Tier 1 building relationships, here's a photo of students at the University of California at Berkeley engaged in a conversation around Title IX and sexual misconduct and the meaning of sexual consent. And the purpose is to engage people in rather intimate conversations and create a structure for those conversations where they can talk about these issues in a safe way and learn from each other about what their normative standards and expectations can and should be, as well as what campus policy and even federal law requires. So the goals are outlined here: building community, strengthening relationships, creating a safe container for difficult dialogue, voicing harms and concerns in the community, and collaborating, making commitments about what they will do personally and collectively to move forward. And then I want to turn, so that's a brief on Tier 1, then I want to turn to Tier 2, and what do we do when accusations occur? And the primary restorative model is the Restorative Justice Conference, which essentially exists in 3 phases. Very importantly, the pre-conference phase, which prepares people to enter into a dialogue with one another and also creates space for people, particularly the facilitators, to assess whether it's safe to bring people together in dialogue, for them to meet in a restorative conference, and then for an agreement to be created, and then some kind of follow-up, mentoring, monitoring, and support to make sure that there is follow-through. So thinking back to that Missoula case, what fell apart really was that there was no restorative infrastructure in place to support those students in the accountability that they had preliminarily agreed upon. So we are absolutely committed to this being a voluntary process. It would coincide with other options. So if students want to file formal complaints, go to the police, do nothing, whatever it is that they want to do, they have another option available to them. And it's very much guided by facilitators who are well-trained, not only in restorative practice, but also in all of the issues associated with sexual harm. These are some of the guiding questions that are characteristic of a restorative justice process, asking about what happened and what they were thinking at the time and what have they thought about since, and what was the harm, and how can the harm be addressed, and how can trust be restored. So a full exploration of those topics. And people often ask me, why would they choose to do this? And these are some of the answers that we routinely get when we talk to harm parties, and then I'll follow it up with accused students or offenders. But some of the drivers for harm parties to engage in a restorative process are captured by these statements. Having a voice, wanting to have a say in what happens going forward, explaining how they've been harmed, needing to know if they're safe, wanting to know if the person's sorry. Often they have questions. What were you thinking? When I said this, why didn't you listen? I thought you heard me. So questions that only can be answered by the offender. And then often, they really, I think this is often underplayed, but victims often want something good to come out of a bad situation. And so probably the two most common things we hear is a desire for acknowledgement that this has happened, so they want to be believed, and acknowledgement by the person who caused the harm that what happened was real and that they understand it, and that they want to make sure that this person doesn't do the same thing to anybody else. So something good that would come from it is prevention or deterrence for reoffending. There's a slightly different set of motivations for offenders to participate in this, and they're captured by these four statements. I'm not a bad person. I want to explain what happened from my perspective. I feel bad. And I want to take responsibility. So often if you give people a pathway to accountability, they will take it. Because otherwise they're left in this kind of purgatory where they know what they've done was wrong. They want to avoid the punitive outcome of going to jail or being expelled, but they would like to make amends if possible. Probably the most influential of the incentives to participate in this is the first one, the I'm not a bad person. The self-conception is different from the now community conception of the person. So people are quick to label someone a sex offender, but that's usually not how they see themselves. And they want to communicate who they are in totality. Much of the restorative justice world is focused on bringing people together in dialogue, but I think around this topic, that's probably going to be less common. And there are many other restorative modalities that will probably be more common. We're starting to see this already. So we may have people who don't want to sit face-to-face in a room together, but they may want to have a Skype conversation because that feels safer. We know of instances of people exchanging videos. So in other words, the harmed party would record a video where he or she explains how they were harmed, and then the offender watches that video and then records a video response to that. So we're thinking about various ways of engaging in dialogue that is not necessarily face-to-face. Exchanging writing, sharing an impact statement, having someone represent in a face-to-face dialogue the victim perspective. The victim doesn't want to participate directly. Or sitting in victim support circles where either a victim sits in circle with others who are there to support the victim, or a group of victims sit together in circle to mutually support each other. So I want to share a case that I know about from a university in the Pacific Northwest. That's Mount Rainier in the background. It's a beautiful campus. But bad things happen in nice places. These are pseudonyms, actually chosen by the students themselves. Anwen and Samir were freshmen, first-year students at the college when Samir sexually assaulted Anwen. Anwen did what most students do. She said nothing to anybody and proceeded with her life. This is a small college. They saw each other often. They had overlapping friendship circles. They served in student leadership roles together, and years went by. She watched him closely, but she didn't talk about it with him or anybody else. Her final year, her final semester, she's nearing graduation, and she decides that she can't sit on this any longer. And she goes to the student conduct administrator, his name is Frank, and says, look, this thing happened to me. I know this student, I've been watching him over these years. I don't think he's done this to anybody else. I can't graduate without some measure of accountability. I'm not going to tell you his name unless you assure me that you're not going to take this to the police and that you're not going to carry out some kind of formal hearing process that would lead to his suspension or expulsion in his final semester. I want to see him graduate. What I want is for him to know what he did to me and to understand the full implications of the harm. And Frank said, okay. He said, I will help. Frank had recently participated in restorative justice training, and he was being presented with his first opportunity to use a restorative process for someone who was saying, if it's not a restorative process, I'm not going forward. And so he agreed, and she told Frank Samir's name, and Frank met with Samir and told him what Anwen told Frank, and Samir was devastated, but he also knew what he did. And he said that he himself had been sitting on what he had done with great remorse for those 3 years and not knowing what to do in response, and that he would absolutely be willing to do whatever he could to make things right. So so what the request was for an exchange of writing. She had written about the trauma she had experienced, and she asked him to read what she had written and get a written response. And then he wrote a response, and because his response was heartfelt and genuine in her view, she then wanted to meet with him face to face. And when she was able to do that, they were able to have a conversation that was healing for her, but also direct confrontation over the behavior. And out of that, they explored what they wanted to do in response, what he needed to do. But in fact, what they wanted to do was something collaborative. They wanted to do some writing together and write about the incident in a campus student publication. And they wanted to meet with his fraternity where this had occurred and confront the behavior of the fraternity, or the mindset and attitudes, that rape culture that I had earlier referred to, and challenge them to do better themselves. And they did that. And there was more to it, but it was a very successful restorative process for them. So let me circle back. I'm getting close to winding up to the movement and what's changed. I mentioned an organization called EROC, End Rape on Campus, that was co-founded by this young woman, Sophie Karasik, who was sexually assaulted at the University of California at Berkeley, and the university handled her case badly. And she was part of the movement that was challenging universities to do better, very adversarial, very distrustful of universities. At that time, the Obama administration became very interested in campus sexual assault and enhancing their efforts to support Title IX legislation. This is Vice President Joe Biden warmly meeting with Sophie at actually the Academy Awards a couple of years, 3-4 years ago. So the characteristic of the movement was really confrontational at that time. Recently, Sophie wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. The title is here, I'm a campus sexual assault activist. It's time to reimagine how we punish sex crimes. This was back in March. And I think she represents change in the student movement. So here's what she said. As the campus sexual assault movement, and now Me Too, has made clear, sexual injustices from harassment to rape to assault, are deeply ingrained in American society, involving people from all walks of life. We cannot jail, fire, or expel our way out of this crisis. We need institutional responses to sexual harm that prioritize both justice and healing, not one at the expense of the other. So right now, there has been so much curiosity and desire for restorative responses, because after years of more formal approaches to this problem, students are still miserable and not coming forward. And so what was once a much more skeptical movement has really shifted gears and leading to some new changes. So the last thing I wanted to share is what's happening at the College of New Jersey, which is a pioneer in this work. The dean who was responsible for Title IX complaints, her name is Jordan Draper, was frustrated over that statistic I shared with you earlier, that there were so many sexual assaults and so few students willing to move forward in a disciplinary way, that she hired 4 students last summer during the break who had been sexually assaulted, and all of whom said that they would not file a formal Title IX complaint. She hired them to spend the summer with her designing a process that would meet their needs, a process that they would say yes to and not no to. And what they designed was a restorative justice process. And then in the fall semester, they were trained in restorative practices by our team. And then this past spring semester, they launched their program, and they had their first cases. As it's turning out, more students are choosing the restorative option. They did not eliminate the formal Title IX hearing process, so some students choose that. More students choose the restorative process, and they have been very happy and successful with the outcomes so far. Every one of them so far has chosen this more indirect, non-face-to-face approach to addressing their needs and getting accountability. One of the students, for example, was in this pre-conference phase, meeting one-on-one with the facilitators before entertaining the idea of a face-to-face, and clarifying for herself what she wanted to get out of the process and what she wanted to say. And then coincidentally, she bumped into the other student, the offender, on the weekend on campus, and she confronted him directly. And she said what she wanted to say, and then she came back to Jordan Monday morning to share her experience, and she was elated, and she said, I never could have confronted him without this preparation process, this reflection, and this sense of empowerment that I got through the process offered. So while that was not a formal restorative process, in the end, it was meeting the needs of the students. So just to sum up, in the last 10 years, we've seen a grassroots movement evolve that was largely confrontational, and we saw in the previous administration, Obama administration, taking that seriously with their Title IX goals and mandates. But then we also saw a failure, even though the systems were built, students were not availing themselves of the systems. And now we see people like Sophie Karasik kind of changing their tune, saying, it's not those legalistic systems we need something restorative. And campuses like the College of New Jersey trying things out. So we're just at the beginning stages of this process, and I will stop here, and if people have any questions or comments, I'm happy to respond.